Stay in the car. That's all he said, my son. His voice carried that mix of hurried authority he used when he was trying not to make a scene. He was already stepping out, pulling his jacket tighter as the cool air rushed in through the open door. The trunk clicked open, and before I could even ask what he meant, the others had begun lifting bags, bright with ribbons and wrapping paper. I sat there, hands resting on my lap, my fingers grazing the edge of the seatbelt as though it could anchor me to something solid. Through the windshield I watched them, my son, his wife, and their 2 children, bustling about with the kind of energy families carry when excitement hangs in the air. It wasn't the kind of trip one forgets. They had planned it for weeks, talking about it at dinners, sorting lists of who would bring what, and deciding which gifts would be opened early and which would be saved. I had listened, nodding, smiling in all the right places, but I never heard my name folded into those plans. I had convinced myself that the omission was an oversight, that surely they would not leave me out. Surely not me, their mother, their grandmother. And yet, at that curb, the truth stood in front of me as clearly as the cold sky above. They lifted the gifts out one by one, large boxes tied with gold bows, small packages wrapped in red, a soft blue bag with tissue paper bursting like clouds. Each item seemed to glow as they carried it away, while my lap sat empty, my hands restless. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and roasted coffee drifting from the terminal. People hurried past, dragging suitcases, hugging loved ones, calling out last goodbyes. The world carried on with its reunions and departures, while I remained anchored in that idling car, invisible. I thought of saying something. I thought of opening the door and stepping out, standing there among them with my questions spilling into the cold air. Why can't I come? Why am I left behind? But my son's words rang again, firm and clipped, stay in the car. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in false gentleness. So I stayed. The door closed behind him, and I watched through the glass as he handed out instructions, pointing which bag should go on top, which should be handled carefully. His wife nodded, her scarf slipping slightly as she leaned over the luggage. The children were laughing, their cheeks pink from the chill, their small hands clapping at the excitement of travel. Their joy cut through me, not because I resented them, but because joy can wound when it reminds you of what you're not allowed to hold. I pressed my hands together and breathed, once, slowly, the way one does in church when the hymns end and silence fills the pews. In that breath I tried to gather myself, but a heaviness lingered, coiled deep in my chest. They didn't notice me watching. Or perhaps they did and pretended not to. Pretending is easier than facing the hurt you cause. I had lived long enough to know that truth. People wound each other most often not with cruelty, but with the ease of ignoring what stands right in front of them. My reflection in the rearview mirror startled me, eyes glossy, lips pressed too thin. I looked older than I had imagined. There were more lines around my mouth than I remembered, more silver threaded through my hair. I wondered if that was part of it, if, to them, I had become too old, too slow, too much of a weight on their lightness. Perhaps the thought of maneuvering my cane through airport terminals, of waiting for me to catch up, had felt like a burden. Still, I thought, isn't family the place where burdens are meant to be shared? I had shared theirs. When my son was small, I carried his fevers through the night, damp cloths pressed to his forehead while I stayed awake, my own body begging for sleep. When his wife was recovering after their first child, I spent weeks cooking meals, folding laundry, rocking the baby through the evenings so they could rest. When money was tight, I dipped into savings I had no luxury of replenishing. Never once did I think of those acts as burdens. They were what love required. And yet, here I sat, at the edge of their joy, asked to remain unseen. The last bag was unloaded. My son slammed the trunk shut and checked his watch. He spoke to his wife, who nodded briskly, adjusting her coat. They gathered together, a unit, a whole that I was not part of. Then they began to walk away, the children skipping, the luggage rolling along with them. Not a glance back. Not even a wave. I thought of rolling down the window, calling out their names, reminding them that I was still there, that I was more than the shadow sitting behind glass. But the words knotted in my throat, heavy and unshaped. So I stayed silent, watching them fade into the current of travelers until the crowd swallowed them whole. The engine hummed quietly, a steady sound against the noise of the airport. I sat still, my breath fogging the window. A part of me wanted to cry, to let the tears fall and wet the silence with some form of release. But another part of me resisted, stubborn in its refusal to let them see my brokenness, even from afar. Instead, I reached for my purse, fumbling with the clasp, pulling out the old handkerchief I always carried. Not to dry tears, none had yet escaped, but to have something to hold, something that connected me to myself. The fabric was soft from years of use, embroidered with a tiny rose in one corner. My mother had given it to me when I was a young girl, telling me that every woman should carry something that reminded her she was more than the world believed. I pressed it into my palm and whispered to myself, almost too quietly to hear, "You are still here." The words steadied me, if only slightly. I turned the key, shifted the gear, and pulled away from the curb. The drive home blurred, though I remember fragments, the way the headlights smeared across wet pavement, the flicker of neon signs outside diners, the faint static of the radio I couldn't bring myself to switch off. The car smelled faintly of pine from the air freshener I had hung weeks ago. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, as though holding on to direction itself. When I reached my house, the quiet was heavier than usual. I parked in the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the dark for a moment. The silence pressed close, and in it, I heard the echo of my son's words again. "Stay in the car." I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar creak of the floorboards. The air held the scent of the lavender sachets I tucked into drawers long ago, mixed with the faint mustiness of a home too often left to itself. I set down my purse and hung my coat, moving slowly, each action deliberate, as though I were reminding myself of who I was through routine. I boiled water for tea, the kettle's whistle slicing through the stillness. The warmth of the cup steadied my hands as I sat at the kitchen table. I watched the steam rise, curling into shapes that dissolved too quickly. It reminded me of how moments dissolve, the ones where you think you belong, gone before you even realize they were slipping away. I thought of calling someone, an old friend, perhaps, or my sister who lived 2 states away. But the words I would have to say felt too raw, they left me. They asked me to stay in the car while they carried their lives forward without me. I wasn't ready to speak that aloud. Saying it would make it too real. So I sipped my tea in silence, the taste of chamomile both soothing and bitter in my mouth. In the stillness, memories pressed in. Times when my son was small and would reach for my hand at crowded fairs. Times when he would look for me in the stands during his school plays. Times when he would sit at the table with me, eager to share his dreams of what he wanted to become. How easily those memories clashed with the present, where I was not the hand he reached for, not the face he looked back to see, not the person included in the unfolding of his life. I told myself I would not let bitterness root itself in me. Bitterness eats quietly, gnawing at the heart until nothing but hollow remains. I had seen it in neighbors, in widows who could speak of nothing but grievances, in men who sat alone on porches muttering about betrayal. No, I would not let bitterness become my only company. But what then? What do you do when your own family draws a line where you cannot cross? The question settled deep, unanswered. I sat with it, letting it weigh me down, pressing into me like the winter chill seeping through old windows. It was then, in that silence, that I realized something. I had been waiting for them to carry me with them. Waiting for inclusion, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for love to be shown in the way I needed. But perhaps waiting had left me too passive, too small. Perhaps the only way to soften the weight of exclusion was to step into my own presence again, to remind myself that even when they left me behind, I could still choose to move forward. I didn't yet know what that meant. Not in concrete actions, not in grand gestures. But I knew it began with a decision, the quiet, stubborn decision that my life was not over simply because they walked ahead without me. So I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and stood at the window. Outside, the street was empty, the lamplight spilling onto patches of frost. My reflection looked back at me, tired but steady. I whispered again, this time louder, to the woman in the glass, "You are still here." And though the night remained heavy, those words felt like a seed planted, fragile, small, but alive. The next morning, the house was still. It always is in winter, when even the air seems reluctant to move. I woke later than usual, though woke is not quite the word. I had spent most of the night drifting in and out of shallow dreams, waking at every creak and sigh of the house. My son's voice kept replaying in my head, short and clipped, "Stay in the car." It came to me the way a hammer strikes a nail, sudden, blunt, echoing. I made my way to the kitchen slowly, my cane tapping the floor in its steady rhythm. The light filtering through the curtains was thin and gray, the kind that makes everything look washed out. I put the kettle on again, as I always do, because tea has a way of anchoring me. The cupboards were quiet as I opened them, rows of mugs waiting patiently. I chose the chipped one, the one with faded sunflowers on its side. My daughter-in-law had once asked why I kept it. "It's too old," she'd said, wrinkling her nose. "But I like its imperfection. The chip reminds me that things can still serve their purpose even when no longer whole." I sat at the table with my tea, staring at the wood grain, tracing its lines with my eyes as though they could lead me somewhere else. The silence pressed close. Normally, I'd hear the phone ring in the morning with a casual check-in, or perhaps a message about picking up the children from school, or a request to watch them for an hour. But the phone stayed quiet. They had boarded their plane, flown into their holiday, wrapped themselves in the warmth of belonging. And I remained here. The hours stretched. I tried to occupy myself, folding laundry, watering the plants that drooped by the window, sweeping the crumbs that had gathered under the table. Each task felt like a thread too thin to hold the weight of the day. When I sat down again, the ache returned. I found myself remembering other moments of being left behind, small ones I had brushed aside at the time. The dinner I wasn't invited to when they celebrated a work promotion. The trip to the beach I only heard about afterward, when the children showed me photographs of sandcastles I hadn't helped build. Each time, I had told myself it didn't matter, that families change, that young people deserve their own lives. But the memories collected like stones, each one added quietly until the pile was too heavy to ignore. I stood by the window and looked out at the yard. The grass was brittle and brown, the trees bare. A bird hopped along the fence, pecking at something unseen. I wondered what it was like to live so lightly, to take only what you need and fly away again. My own life felt rooted in waiting, waiting for visits, waiting for phone calls, waiting for someone to remember me. I thought of my mother again. She had lived alone too, in her later years, though I visited her often. I never let her feel like an afterthought, or at least I tried not to. She had a way of making even her solitude graceful. She would knit in the afternoons, the soft click of needles keeping rhythm with the radio. She'd serve tea in porcelain cups, never mugs, as though each small ritual was worth honoring. When I asked her once if she felt lonely, she smiled and said, "Lonely sometimes, yes. But invisible? Never. Because I see myself." Those words came back to me now, sharp with truth. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeing myself. I decided, almost without thinking, to leave the house. The walls were pressing in too tightly. I wrapped myself in my old wool coat, slipped my feet into boots that had seen better years, and stepped into the cold. The air bit at my cheeks, but it woke me. The street was quiet, only the occasional hum of a passing car. Frost clung to the edges of lawns, sparkling faintly in the pale light. I walked slowly, each step measured, cane steadying me. Neighbors passed now and then, offering polite nods, brief smiles. I wondered what they saw when they looked at me, the quiet woman alone, perhaps, or just another passerby. None of them knew that only yesterday I had sat in a car at the airport, watching my family walk away. None of them knew how a single sentence could cut deeper than years of distance. I reached the small park at the end of the street and sat on a bench. The wood was cold beneath me, the metal arms colder still. A few children were playing near the swings, their laughter carried on the crisp air. I watched them run, their scarves trailing behind them, their mittens clumsy as they climbed the slide. Their joy was loud, unapologetic, and for a moment I let it wash over me. A woman about my age sat on the opposite bench, a small dog curled beside her. She glanced at me and offered a smile. I smiled back, though faintly. We didn't speak. Sometimes silence between strangers feels kinder than words. As I sat there, I realized something: my world had grown too small. It had narrowed to the boundaries of my son's family, to the rhythm of their calls, their visits, their needs. And when they withdrew, my world collapsed with them. It was no wonder the exclusion stung so deeply. I had given them the power to define whether I mattered. The thought startled me, but it also brought a strange relief. If I had given that power away, perhaps I could take it back. I stayed in the park until the cold seeped into my bones. When I returned home, I felt lighter, though only slightly. Enough to notice the stack of books on the shelf that I had been meaning to read. Enough to decide that perhaps tomorrow I would walk again, maybe even further. That evening, I made myself a better meal than usual. Not just toast and tea, but roasted chicken with rosemary, carrots glazed in butter, and a small glass of wine I had been saving. Cooking for one can feel pointless, but as the smells filled the kitchen, I reminded myself that I was worth the effort. When I sat at the table, I lit a candle, its flame flickering gently. My son's family was hundreds of miles away, but I did not need their presence to make the meal meaningful. Still, when I went to bed, the ache returned. The bed felt too large, the night too long. I thought again of the airport, of the way they didn't look back. I wondered if they even thought of me now, or if I had already slipped from their minds. The days that followed unfolded slowly. I walked each morning, further than before. I began stopping at the cafe near the corner, ordering a small coffee, sometimes a scone. The barista learned my name quickly, her smile genuine. We exchanged small pleasantries, about the weather, about how quiet the mornings were. It was nothing extraordinary, but it was something. A thread of connection, however thin. One afternoon, as I sat at the cafe, I overheard two women at the next table talking about a book club they attended at the library. My ears caught on the words like a thread snagging cloth. A book club. I hadn't read in years with company, not since my teaching days. I sat there, stirring my coffee longer than needed, pretending not to listen, while my heart tugged quietly at the thought. When I returned home, I looked up the library's schedule. The book club met on Wednesdays, in the late afternoon. I told myself I couldn't go, that it was too late to join, that strangers would look at me the way my family had, as someone to be set aside. But another part of me whispered, "What do you have to lose?" That night, I stood again at the window, looking at my reflection in the glass. The woman who looked back seemed steadier now, though her eyes still carried shadows. I whispered the words again, the ones I had clung to since that night, "You are still here." The phrase no longer felt like a plea. It felt like a promise. And with that, I decided, I would go to the book club. Even if I only sat in the back and said nothing, I would go. It was a small step, perhaps insignificant to anyone else. But to me, it was a beginning, a way to stretch the boundaries of my world beyond the walls of waiting. I slept a little easier that night, the ache still present but softened by the possibility of something new. The following Wednesday, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have. My coat was buttoned, my scarf wrapped twice around my neck, yet I still lingered, fussing with the angle of the fabric as though the right fold might grant me courage. I almost laughed at myself, a grown woman, a grandmother, nervous over walking into a library. But it had been a long time since I had stepped into something new without my family beside me. Too long. The afternoon air was brisk when I left the house. My cane clicked against the pavement, steady and reassuring. The streets were quiet, lined with bare trees whose branches stretched like veins against the pale sky. As I neared the library, my chest tightened. A voice in my head whispered, "Turn back. You don't belong here." But another voice, quieter yet firmer, reminded me, "You are still here." The library doors slid open with a soft hiss, and warmth greeted me. The smell of paper and polished wood wrapped around me like an old blanket. Children whispered near the picture books, a young man tapped at his laptop in the corner, and an elderly couple searched through the large print section. The normalcy of it all soothed me, though my nerves buzzed still. I found the meeting room easily, its glass walls revealing a circle of chairs already filling with people. My first instinct was to hover at the door, but before I could retreat, a woman with short gray hair spotted me. "Hello there," she called warmly. "Are you here for the club?" Her voice carried none of the hesitation I had expected. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yes," I managed, surprised at how small my voice sounded. Come in," she said, waving me over. "We're just about to start." "I'm Margaret." I stepped inside, the room buzzing with quiet chatter. 10 or so people were seated, books balanced on laps or tables. They made space for me, smiling, offering nods of welcome. I lowered myself into a chair, adjusting my coat, my cane resting against the side. For a moment, I felt out of place, an outsider stepping into someone else's circle. But no one looked at me that way. They looked as though they were glad I had come. The book of the week was The Remains of the Day. I had read it years ago, and though I hadn't picked it up recently, the story lingered somewhere in my memory. As the discussion began, people spoke about dignity, about duty, about the quiet cost of giving too much of oneself away. Their voices rose and fell, weaving thoughts together. When they turned to me, asking what I thought, I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. My instinct was to say little, to shrink into the safety of silence. But something pushed me forward. "I remember," I began, my voice halting, "when I first read this book, I thought the butler's devotion was admirable. But now I see the sadness in it. How much he gave, and how little was returned." The room grew quiet, listening. I fumbled for words, then found them. "It makes me wonder how often we serve others until we vanish. Until they don't even notice we're gone." There was a pause, then a murmur of agreement. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind. "That's beautifully said." Something in me shifted then, not dramatically, not with a flourish, but like a small stone dislodging in a stream. I had spoken, and I had been heard. Not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not as the one waiting in the car. Just as myself. The rest of the meeting flowed more easily. I listened, I added a thought here and there, and each time someone responded, I felt the boundaries of my small world stretch just a little wider. By the end, when people were gathering coats and bags, Margaret turned to me again. "Will we see you next week?" she asked. The question startled me with its simplicity. It wasn't about obligation or duty. It was an invitation. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier now. "I'd like that." Walking home, the air felt sharper, the light beginning to fade into early evening. My legs ached, but the ache was softened by something new, a quiet sense of belonging. For so long, my place in the world had been defined by others, by whether they wanted me near. But here, in a circle of strangers, I had found a place simply by showing up. That night, I poured myself another glass of wine and sat by the window. The street lamp outside hummed faintly, casting its glow on the frosted lawn. I thought of my family, far away, likely gathered in warmth, exchanging stories, laughter, gifts. The ache was still there, it would not vanish overnight. But it no longer defined the whole of me. For the first time in a long while, I felt that perhaps my life could still open, even now. Not because someone else gave me permission, but because I had stepped into it myself. And with that thought, I whispered once more, but differently now, less a plea, more a truth, I am still here. The following week, I arrived at the library a little earlier. My coat felt less like a shield and more like a companion against the winter air. As I approached the doors, I caught myself humming, a habit I hadn't noticed in years. Something light, tuneless, but undeniably mine. The act startled me, almost embarrassed me, but I let it continue. Inside, the warmth of the library wrapped around me again, that familiar scent of paper and wood. Margaret was already there, stacking chairs into a circle. When she saw me, her face lit up with recognition. "There you are," she said, as though she had been expecting me, as though my presence mattered. It had been so long since anyone said that to me. The book that week was different, a collection of poems. I hadn't prepared, hadn't read them in advance, but when the group began to take turns reading aloud, I joined in. My voice trembled at first, but the words steadied me. There was something liberating about speaking someone else's thoughts, about borrowing language that carried more weight than I could give my own. One of the poems spoke of a woman standing at a train platform, watching a loved one leave, her heart breaking but her body rooted. The image struck too close, too raw. I felt the sting of tears but blinked them back, pressing the words into my chest silently. You know this feeling. You have lived it. After the meeting, Margaret invited me for coffee with a few others. My instinct was to decline, politeness wrapped in excuses, but I stopped myself. Say yes, I told myself. You have stayed home long enough. The cafe was bustling, the hiss of steam and the clink of cups filling the air. We found a table, and I listened as the conversation tumbled easily between them. They spoke of books, yes, but also of gardens, of grandchildren, of aching knees and favorite recipes. Ordinary things. I found myself smiling, adding a word here and there, feeling the warmth of their laughter wash over me. It wasn't family, but it was something real. That night, back at home, I realized the ache of exclusion had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a sharp wound, it was a scar, tender but no longer bleeding. I had carried the weight of my family's rejection for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen in other ways. And yet, even as I felt lighter, the silence of my phone was loud. No call, no message, no acknowledgement that I existed on the other side of their trip. I wondered if they thought of me at all, if the children asked where I was. I wanted to believe they did. But I also knew how easily absence can slip into forgetfulness. The following Sunday, I went to church, though I hadn't been in months. The pews creaked under familiar weight, hymns rising to fill the air. I sang softly, my voice rusty, but the act itself felt healing. After the service, a woman I knew distantly pressed my hand and asked if I'd join the group that prepared meals for the shelter on Tuesdays. Again, my instinct was to decline. But I heard my mother's words, see yourself. So I agreed. Tuesday morning, I stood in the church kitchen, peeling carrots with a line of other women. The smell of onions sizzling in butter filled the air, laughter bouncing from wall to wall. My hands ached from the work, but my heart felt steadier. Each chopped carrot, each stirred pot, felt like proof that I still had something to offer. It struck me then, all these years, I had defined myself only by how I cared for my family. When they withdrew, I thought my usefulness ended. But here, among strangers and acquaintances, my hands were still welcome. My presence still mattered. Weeks passed this way, library Wednesdays, shelter Tuesdays, slow mornings with tea and books, afternoons with small walks. My life, once narrowed to waiting for others, began to widen in ways I hadn't expected. The ache of my son's absence lingered, yes, but it no longer held all the space. And then one afternoon, the phone rang. My heart leapt at the sound, hope surging before I even lifted the receiver. Mom, my son's voice came, casual, as though no time had passed. We're back. The trip was great. The kids had a wonderful time. I pressed the receiver tighter to my ear, waiting for more. Waiting for acknowledgement, apology, something to bridge the distance. But his words carried only summary, not reflection. Would you like to see the photos? He asked. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to rush to their house, to sit with the children and hear their laughter firsthand. But a new firmness had settled in me. Perhaps another day, I said instead. I've plans this evening. The words surprised me. They were true, the book club was meeting, but more than that, they carried weight. For the first time in years, I had something that was mine, something that did not bend around their schedule. There was a pause on his end, surprise flickering in the silence. Oh. All right, Mom. Another day then. When I hung up, I felt both grief and power. Grief that he had not noticed my absence, that he still did not understand the hurt. But power in knowing that my world no longer revolved only around him. That evening, as I sat among my circle at the library, I felt the weight shift again. Belonging, I realized, does not always come from where we expect. Sometimes it grows in the cracks of rejection, in the spaces left empty. The discussion that night was about resilience, about characters who rebuild after loss. As others spoke, I thought quietly to myself, I am rebuilding too. Walking home, the cold air bit at my cheeks, but I felt alive. The lamplight glistened on the frost, and for once, the night did not feel heavy. At home, I poured tea and stood by the window, watching my breath cloud the glass. My reflection stared back at me, the same lines, the same silver hair. But I saw more now, not just the woman left in the car, not just the mother waiting for a call. I saw a woman who had walked into new rooms, who had spoken and been heard, who had chosen to matter. And softly, steadily, I whispered again, I am still here. This time, the words did not feel like survival. They felt like becoming. It was a Saturday when my son finally came by. The knock on the door startled me. I had grown used to the stillness of weekends, the rhythm of my own company. When I opened it, he stood there, a little awkward, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. The children weren't with him. Neither was his wife. "Hi, Mom," he said, offering a quick smile. "Thought I'd stop in." I stepped aside, letting him in. The air between us felt heavy, as though we were both aware of something unspoken but neither ready to name it. He glanced around the living room, at the books stacked on the table, at the vase of fresh flowers I had bought for myself. "You've been busy," he remarked. I nodded. "I have." We sat at the kitchen table. I poured tea without asking, habit. For a while, we spoke of small things, the children's school projects, the trip he had just returned from, the weather that had turned icy. But beneath it all, I felt the weight pressing closer, demanding acknowledgement. Finally, I set my cup down. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice was steady. "Why didn't you ask me to come?" He froze, the words landing heavier than I had expected. His eyes flicked to mine, then away. "Mom," he sighed, running a hand over his face. "It was complicated. We thought it might be hard for you, with the airports, the walking, the everything. We didn't want you to feel out of place." I let the silence stretch. My heart ached, not just from the exclusion itself but from how easily he explained it, as though leaving me behind had been an act of kindness. "Out of place," I repeated softly. "Do you know what it feels like to watch your family walk away from you? To sit in a car, invisible, while the people you love unload their joy in front of you?" He shifted uncomfortably, staring into his tea. "I didn't mean it like that." "But that's what it was," I said, my voice breaking despite my effort to hold it steady. "You didn't mean it, but you did it. And you've done it before. Dinners, trips, moments where I was no longer included." I kept telling myself it didn't matter. But it does. It matters. His eyes finally met mine, startled at the rawness of my words. For a long moment, he said nothing. I took a breath, pressing my hand flat on the table to keep it from shaking. "I am not asking to be carried everywhere. I am asking not to be forgotten. I am asking to still be part of the family I gave my life to." The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. My son swallowed, his throat tight. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said at last. The words were quiet, almost unsure. But they were words I had waited to hear. I nodded, not in forgiveness yet, but in acknowledgement. "I needed you to say that." We sat in silence for a while after that, the tea growing cold between us. It wasn't a full reconciliation, wounds like that don't heal in an afternoon. But something had shifted. The truth had been spoken, no longer festering in silence. When he left, hugging me briefly at the door, I felt both drained and lighter. Grief still clung, but it was no longer shapeless. It had been named, and in naming it, I had taken back some measure of power. That night, I went to the window again, as I often did. The street was quiet, the frost gleaming under lamplight. My reflection stared back at me, lined and tired, but steadier. I thought of the book club, of the women at the shelter, of Margaret's kind smile. I thought of the moment at the table when my son's eyes finally met mine, and for once he heard me not as an accessory to his life, but as a woman with a voice. I whispered again, not out of habit but out of conviction, I am still here. And this time, I believed it. The days after my son's visit felt different. Not lighter, exactly, more like a storm had passed and left the air clearer, though the ground was still wet. I carried his apology in my chest, small and hesitant though it was. It did not erase the hurt, but it softened the sharpest edges. More importantly, I carried the knowledge that I had spoken, that I had not swallowed my pain in silence. I continued with my new rhythms. Tuesdays at the shelter, Wednesdays at the book club, quiet mornings with tea, long walks that traced the edges of my neighborhood. Each step felt like stitching, small threads pulling my life into a new pattern. I was still alone often, but loneliness had changed. It no longer defined me, it visited sometimes, like weather passing through, but it no longer lived in me. One Wednesday, after the book club, Margaret asked if I would join her and a few others for lunch at a small diner down the street. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and pie under glass domes. I said yes, and as we sat there with steaming bowls of soup and thick slices of bread, I realized how long it had been since I had laughed freely in the company of others. The sound startled me, it rose out of me, rusty but real. "Your laugh is wonderful," Margaret said, smiling. "You should use it more." I tucked the words away like a keepsake. At home, I began tending more to the things I had neglected. I polished the wooden table until it gleamed, hung fresh curtains in the kitchen, repotted the plants by the window. None of these tasks were extraordinary, but each one felt like a declaration: this home, this life, still matters. My son visited again, this time with the children. They tumbled into the house with their backpacks and chatter, filling the rooms with energy. I sat with them, listening to their stories of the trip I had not been part of. For a moment, the old ache rose, but I held it gently instead of letting it consume me. I listened, I smiled, and when they asked if I would come to their school concert next month, I said yes. Later, after they had gone, I thought about how fragile families can be, how easily bonds fray, how often love is complicated by neglect or blindness. But I also thought about resilience, about how relationships, like people, can heal in uneven ways. My son and I would never return to what we once were, but perhaps we could learn a different kind of closeness, one where my voice was no longer silent. Spring came slowly, the snow retreating in patches, the ground softening under the sun. I walked one morning without my heavier coat, the air brisk but gentle. Crocuses pushed through the soil by the churchyard, small bursts of color against the gray. I paused to look at them, struck by how determined they seemed, fragile petals insisting on blooming in a world still half frozen. I thought then of myself. How easily I could have remained in that car, not just at the airport but in my life, waiting, silent, invisible. But I had stepped out, slowly, stubbornly, into the cold air. I had spoken, joined, laughed, planted new roots. And though my family had left me behind once, I had not left myself. That evening, I boiled water for tea, the same ritual as always, but I set out 2 cups instead of 1. One for myself, and one for the memory of my mother, who had taught me that invisibility is not the same as absence. I sipped slowly, letting the warmth spread, and whispered the words again, no longer out of need, but out of truth. I am still here. The kettle cooled, the light faded, and I sat in the quiet with my cup, steady in the knowledge that presence, my own presence, was enough.